Commander Vector adjusted his 4 optical sensors as he gazed across the assembled cadets of the Galactic Military Academy. 237 beings from 43 different species, all eager to prove their worth in the arts of war. And standing at the back of the lecture hall, like a statue carved from granite and bad decisions, was the human. Today, Vector began, his voice carrying the weight of authority earned through 3 decades of service. We will be studying advanced combat tactics through the lens of actual battlefield scenarios. Your instructor for this session is... He paused, his mandibles clicking nervously. Well, he prefers not to speak. A ripple of confusion passed through the cadets. The Zephyrian in the front row, a female named Lyra, raised her crystalline hand. "Commander, how exactly does one teach without speaking?" Vector's laugh was bitter, like someone who'd just discovered their favorite restaurant had been serving recycled protein paste. "Miss Lyra, when your combat record spans 17 different conflicts, includes the single-handed destruction of a Kron battlecruiser, and features a confirmed kill count that's classified at the highest levels, well, sometimes your actions speak louder than any lecture ever could." The human in question, Staff Sergeant Jake Murphy, remained motionless. He was tall by human standards, though still shorter than most of the assembled aliens. His uniform was pristine, his posture perfect, and his eyes. Those eyes held the kind of cold intelligence that made veteran warriors uncomfortable. Murphy had requested this assignment specifically, though nobody quite understood why a decorated war hero would want to babysit academy students. The first scenario, Vector continued, activating the holographic display, involves a standard planetary assault. The target is a heavily fortified Kron stronghold on Kepler 442 billion. 3 previous assault attempts by coalition forces have failed, resulting in 73% casualties. The hologram showed a mountainous terrain dotted with defensive positions. Energy barriers shimmered between towering spires of black metal. Automated turrets swept the approaches with methodical precision. It looked, quite frankly, like a fortress designed by someone who really didn't want visitors. The standard tactical approach, Vector explained, would be to use orbital bombardment to soften the defenses, followed by a coordinated ground assault with armor support. However, the Kron have developed new shield technology that renders orbital strikes ineffective. So, cadets, how would you approach this problem? A young Centaurian named Marcus raised his hand. "Sir, we could use stealth infiltration teams to disable the shields from within." "Excellent suggestion. The Third Fleet tried that. The infiltration teams were detected and eliminated before they could reach the shield generators. Next." A Vorthan cadet, his scales shimmering with nervous energy, spoke up. "What about using electromagnetic pulse weapons to disable their automated defenses? The Kron systems are hardened against EMP attacks. The 5th Regiment learned that the hard way. Their entire assault force was neutralized by the automated turrets." Vector's voice carried a note of grim satisfaction. "Any other brilliant ideas?" The lecture hall fell silent. Even the most confident cadets seemed stumped by the tactical puzzle. That's when Murphy finally moved. Not to speak, mind you, but to walk slowly to the front of the room. His boots clicked against the polished floor with military precision. He stopped in front of the holographic display and simply pointed to a seemingly insignificant ridge line about 2 kilometers from the main fortress. Then he held up one finger. "One." "I'm sorry, Sergeant Murphy, but I don't understand," said Lyra. "What exactly are you indicating?" Murphy looked at her with the patience of someone explaining basic physics to a particularly slow child. He pointed to himself, then to the ridge, then made a gesture that could only be interpreted as boom. Vector's optical sensors widened. "You're suggesting a solo assault?" Murphy nodded once. Sharp, decisive, final. The cadets erupted in nervous laughter. The idea was absurd. One soldier against an entire fortress? It was suicide with delusions of grandeur. Class, Vector said, his voice cutting through the chatter like a plasma blade through butter. Perhaps you should know that Sergeant Murphy didn't just study this scenario. He lived it. 3 months ago, on Kepler 442 billion, he was part of the assault force that finally took this fortress. The laughter died instantly. You could have heard a pin drop in a vacuum. The mission parameters were exactly as I described. 3 failed attempts, massive casualties, and a fortress that seemed impregnable. Command was considering abandoning the operation entirely when Sergeant Murphy volunteered for what was euphemistically called a reconnaissance mission. Murphy had returned to his position at the back of the room, once again becoming a statue of controlled lethality. But now the cadets were looking at him with something approaching respect and fear, mostly fear. The official report, Vector continued, states that Sergeant Murphy conducted a successful infiltration and elimination of key defensive positions, leading to the fortress's capture. In the unofficial report, he paused, glancing at Murphy, who remained expressionless. The unofficial report is classified so far above your clearance level that knowing it exists would probably violate several interstellar treaties. A Rigelian cadet named Zara, her tentacles twitching with curiosity, asked, "But how did one soldier accomplish what 3 full assault forces couldn't?" Vector's mandibles clicked in what might have been amusement. "An excellent question. Perhaps we should examine the next scenario." The hologram shifted, showing a different battlefield. This one was a space station, massive and bristling with weapons. The tactical display showed it was surrounded by a minefield that would make navigation nearly impossible for any conventional force. The Hegemony Research Station Omega-7, Vector announced, recently captured by pirates who are using it as a base of operations. The station contains vital intelligence that cannot be allowed to fall into enemy hands. However, the pirates have threatened to destroy the station if any rescue attempt is made. The cadets studied the display with growing unease. The station was a fortress in space, protected by mines, automated defenses, and presumably a significant pirate force. Attacking it would be virtually impossible without massive losses. Standard procedure would be to negotiate with the pirates, suggested Marcus. We offer them something they want more than the station. The pirates' demands include the release of their leader, who is currently serving a life sentence for crimes that included the systematic extermination of 3 entire colonies. Vector's voice was flat. "Negotiation is not an option." "Then we wait them out," said Zara. "Starve them into submission. The station has enough supplies for 6 months. The intelligence they possess becomes worthless in 3 weeks." Once again, the cadets found themselves stumped. And once again, Murphy stepped forward. This time, he didn't point to the display. Instead, he pulled out a small device from his pocket and set it on the podium. It was unremarkable, about the size of a data pad with a single blinking light. "That," Vector said, his voice barely above a whisper, "is a remote detonator. 3 weeks ago, that device was used to destroy Omega-7 station, along with the 47 pirates who had captured it." The cadets stared at the device as if it were a venomous snake. The implications were staggering. Murphy had somehow gotten close enough to a heavily defended space station to plant explosives, all while avoiding detection by pirates who were presumably on high alert. "How?" Lyra asked, her voice shaking slightly. Murphy picked up the detonator and pointed to himself. Then he made a gesture that looked like swimming through space. Then he pointed to the device and made a small explosion with his hands. He went EVA, Vector translated. Sergeant Murphy conducted a solo spacewalk through the minefield, attached explosives to the station's critical systems, and detonated them remotely. "That's impossible," protested a Corvan cadet whose name tag read Dex. "The radiation from the mines alone would kill anyone in a standard EVA suit." Murphy looked at Dex with the expression of someone who'd just been told that water was dry. He reached into another pocket and pulled out what looked like a medal. But as he held it up, the cadets could see it was melted and twisted, barely recognizable as a military decoration. Sergeant Murphy's EVA suit was exposed to enough radiation to melt his commendation ribbons, Vector explained. He completed the mission anyway. The medical report indicated that he should have died from radiation poisoning 3 times over. But how did he survive? Zara asked. Murphy shrugged. Just shrugged, as if surviving lethal radiation was something that happened to him every Tuesday. The third scenario, Vector continued, clearly eager to move on before the cadets started hyperventilating, involves close-quarters combat aboard a disabled spacecraft. The hologram changed again, showing the interior of what looked like a cargo ship. But this cargo ship was clearly not carrying anything legal. The corridors were narrow, the lighting was dim, and there were obvious signs of recent violence. The transport vessel Lucky Strike was carrying a shipment of illegal weapons to rebel forces on Tau Ceti Prime. Coalition intelligence had tracked the ship for months, waiting for the perfect opportunity to intercept it. However, when our boarding party arrived, they found the ship's crew had been murdered and the cargo was missing. The cadets leaned forward, intrigued despite themselves. This was starting to sound like a mystery rather than a military exercise. The ship's security recordings showed that the crew had been killed by a single individual. Someone who moved through the ship like a ghost, eliminating targets with surgical precision. The question was, who was this mysterious killer, and where had they gone with the weapons? Murphy was now standing directly beside the holographic display, his presence somehow making the simulated crime scene feel more real and infinitely more menacing. The boarding party conducted a thorough search of the ship, but found no trace of the perpetrator. The weapon signatures suggested military-grade equipment, but no military unit had been operating in that sector. It was quite literally a perfect crime. Vector paused, looking around the room at the assembled cadets, until 3 days later, when coalition forces received an anonymous tip about a rebel weapons cache on Tau Ceti Prime. The tip included precise coordinates and detailed intelligence about rebel defensive positions. The commander's optical sensors fixed on Murphy, who was now examining his fingernails with the casual interest of someone waiting for a bus. The subsequent raid was a complete success. Not only did coalition forces recover the stolen weapons, but they also captured the entire rebel leadership cell. The operation was so perfectly executed that it seemed almost planned. Several cadets were beginning to put the pieces together. The expressions on their faces ranged from amazement to horror. The investigation that followed revealed that the mysterious killer had been Sergeant Murphy, conducting a deep cover operation to track the weapons to their final destination. He had eliminated the ship's crew, taken the weapons, and delivered them directly to the rebels, along with enough surveillance equipment to monitor their every move. Murphy finally looked up from his fingernails and gave the cadets what might have been a smile. It was the kind of smile that suggested he knew exactly where you lived and what you had for breakfast. The rebels never suspected that their new weapon supplier was a coalition operative. They welcomed him into their inner circle, shared their plans, and even invited him to participate in their upcoming assault on a coalition outpost. The irony was so thick you could have cut it with a plasma torch. When the rebels attacked the outpost, they found coalition forces waiting in perfect defensive positions. The battle lasted exactly 14 minutes. There were no coalition casualties. Murphy held up his hand, fingers spread wide. 14. Then he made a gesture across his throat. No survivors. The final scenario, Vector continued, his voice now carrying a note of something that might have been awe, involves what military historians call the impossible mission. The hologram shifted one last time, showing a planet that looked like it had been designed by someone with serious psychological issues. The surface was covered in what appeared to be a mixture of active volcanoes, acid rain, and creatures that looked like they'd been rejected from nightmares for being too scary. The planet Hellscape 7, Vector announced. Yes, that's its actual designation. The cartographers who named it clearly had a sense of humor. This world serves as a maximum security prison for the galaxy's most dangerous criminals. The cadets stared at the hellish landscape with growing unease. Even through the hologram, the planet seemed to radiate malevolence. 6 months ago, a high-value prisoner escaped from Hellscape 7. This individual possessed information that could compromise coalition operations across 17 star systems. Recapture was essential. But the prisoner had allies among the other inmates and had effectively turned the entire prison into a fortress. Murphy was now standing at attention, his expression more serious than it had been all day. Whatever this final scenario was, it clearly held special significance. Standard procedure would be to send a full tactical team with heavy support. However, the prison's automated defenses would detect any large-scale assault, triggering a lockdown that would make recapture impossible. The hologram zoomed in on the prison complex, showing multiple levels of security barriers, guard towers, and what looked like enough firepower to level a small city. The mission parameters were simple in concept, impossible in execution. One operative would infiltrate the prison, locate the target, and extract them without triggering the automated defenses. The operative would have no backup, no support, and no way to communicate with command once the mission began. Several cadets were shaking their heads. The mission sounded like suicide with a side order of certain death. Naturally, Vector continued. Only one person volunteered for this assignment. Murphy stepped forward and pointed to himself. Then he made a gesture that looked like sneaking. Then he pointed to the prison complex and made a grabbing motion. Sergeant Murphy infiltrated Hellscape 7 by hiding in a supply transport. He spent 3 days navigating the prison's security systems, locating the target, and planning the extraction. On the 4th day, he made his move. The commander's voice dropped to almost a whisper. The prison's security recordings from that day have been classified at the highest levels. What I can tell you is that Murphy not only extracted the target but also eliminated 17 other high-value prisoners who posed ongoing threats to coalition security. Murphy held up both hands, fingers spread, 17. Then he made a cutting motion across his throat, terminated. The extraction was so clean that the prison administrators didn't realize anything had happened until the next morning. By then, Murphy and his target were already 3 star systems away. The lecture hall had fallen completely silent. Even the environmental systems seemed to be holding their breath. These scenarios, cadets, represent just a fraction of Sergeant Murphy's operational record. In 15 years of active service, he has completed over 200 missions with a success rate of 100%. He has never lost a teammate, never failed an objective, and never left a target alive who was designated for termination. Murphy returned to his position at the back of the room, once again becoming a statue of controlled lethality. But now the cadets were looking at him with something approaching religious awe. Your final examination, Vector announced, will not involve written tests or tactical simulations. Instead, you will be evaluated based on your ability to survive one training exercise designed by Sergeant Murphy himself. The blood drained from several alien faces, or at least the aliens who had blood. The others just looked terrified in species-appropriate ways. The exercise will take place tomorrow at 0600 hours. I suggest you use the remaining time to prepare yourselves mentally and physically. And perhaps Vector added with what might have been sympathy to update your wills. Murphy, still silent, simply nodded once. But that single nod contained more menace than 1,000 threats. As the cadets filed out of the lecture hall, they cast nervous glances at the human who had just become their final exam. None of them spoke. What was there to say? They were about to face a test designed by someone who had turned warfare into an art form and death into a precise science. The Marine still hadn't spoken a word during the entire lecture. But his combat record had done all the talking necessary. Tomorrow, they would find out if they could survive what he had planned for them. The smart money was betting against it. Dawn broke over the Galactic Military Academy like a hangover after a 3-day bender. The cadets had spent the night in various states of panic, preparation and prayer to whatever deities their species favored. Some had tried to research human combat techniques. Others had attempted to find loopholes in academy regulations. A few had simply accepted their fate and written farewell messages to their families. None of it would help them. Commander Vector stood at the edge of Training Ground 7, a massive complex that could simulate any environment known to galactic civilization. Mountains, swamps, urban warfare zones, zero-gravity chambers, hostile atmospheres. If you wanted to die horribly in a specific way, Training Ground 7 could accommodate your request. "Attention cadets," Vector announced as the assembled students formed ragged lines before him. They looked like death warmed over and served on chipped plates. "Today you will participate in what we call practical application of theoretical knowledge. Or as Sergeant Murphy prefers to call it." He paused, consulting his data pad. "Tuesday." Murphy emerged from the equipment shed carrying what appeared to be a single backpack. No weapons, no tactical gear, no ominous machinery of doom. Just a standard-issue military pack that looked like it had seen better decades. Lyra raised her hand tentatively. "Commander, what are the rules of engagement for this exercise?" Vector's mandibles clicked in what might have been amusement. "Rules? Miss Lyra, war doesn't have rules. It has suggestions, most of which involve not dying. However, for insurance purposes, the Academy requires me to inform you that this is a non-lethal exercise." Probably. Squeaked Dex, his Corvan exoskeleton rattling with nervous energy. "Well, Sergeant Murphy's definition of non-lethal is somewhat flexible. You won't die permanently, but you might spend some time wishing you had." Murphy opened his backpack and began pulling out items. A small device that looked like a cross between a scanner and a torture instrument. Several metallic spheres that hummed with barely contained energy. A length of rope that seemed to move on its own. And finally a data pad that he handed to Vector. The commander's optical sensors widened as he read the contents. "Fascinating. It appears Sergeant Murphy has prepared individual challenges for each of you based on your psychological profiles and combat assessments." "Individual challenges?" Marcus asked, his Centaurian confidence beginning to crack like cheap armor. "Oh yes. Murphy has spent the last 3 weeks studying your files, your training records, your personal habits and your deepest fears. He's designed scenarios specifically calculated to push each of you beyond your breaking point." Zara's tentacles writhed with agitation. "That seems unnecessarily cruel." Vector looked at her with the expression of someone explaining why water was wet. "Miss Zara, cruelty is the point. War isn't a friendly competition where everyone gets a participation trophy. It's a brutal, unforgiving test of everything you think you know about yourself. If you can't handle Murphy's training exercise, you certainly can't handle actual combat." Murphy had finished unpacking and was now standing perfectly still, watching the cadets with the intensity of a predator selecting its next meal. He held up his data pad and showed them the display. It contained a simple countdown timer, currently reading 59:47 and decreasing. 1 hour, Vector translated. "That's how long you have to survive Murphy's exercise. The objective is simple: reach the extraction point at the center of the training ground without being eliminated. The methods Murphy will use to eliminate you are creative." The countdown reached 59:30. Murphy pointed to the cadets, then to the various entrances around the training ground's perimeter, then made a shooing motion with his hands. "I believe that's your cue to begin," Vector said helpfully. "Oh, and cadets. Good luck, you're going to need it." The 237 cadets scattered like startled prey animals, each heading for different entry points. Within minutes they had vanished into the maze of simulated environments that made up Training Ground 7. Murphy stood motionless for exactly 30 seconds, apparently giving them a head start. Then he smiled. It was the kind of smile that suggested he knew something they didn't. Something terrible. He picked up his backpack and walked casually toward the nearest entrance. He wasn't hurrying. He wasn't concerned. He was just inevitable. Inside the training ground, the cadets were discovering that Murphy's preparations were far more extensive than anyone had imagined. Lyra, who had entered through the forest simulation, found herself facing what appeared to be a perfectly normal woodland path. Too normal. The kind of normal that made experienced warriors check their weapons and say their prayers. She had made it exactly 47 meters when the ground beneath her feet suddenly became liquid. Not water, not quicksand. Something far more unsettling. She sank up to her waist before managing to grab an overhead branch, her crystalline form providing enough natural buoyancy to keep her from disappearing entirely. Clever, she muttered, recognizing the trap for what it was. Murphy had somehow rigged the path with a localized gravity field that could selectively alter the density of matter. It was technology that shouldn't exist, deployed by someone who clearly didn't care about the laws of physics. Meanwhile, Marcus had chosen the urban warfare simulation, confident that his Centaurian reflexes would give him an advantage in close-quarters combat. He was creeping through what appeared to be an abandoned city block when he heard it. Footsteps. Not the heavy boots of military personnel, but something lighter, more casual, like someone taking a leisurely stroll through a park. He spun around, weapon drawn, and saw nothing. The footsteps continued, seeming to come from every direction at once. Marcus's training kicked in, and he began moving in a tactical formation toward the nearest building. That's when he noticed the shadows. They were wrong. Not obviously wrong, but subtly incorrect in ways that made his brain hurt to process. The shadows moved independently of their sources, reaching toward him with grasping fingers of darkness. This wasn't just psychological warfare. This was psychological warfare designed by someone who understood exactly how Centaurian minds processed visual information. Marcus began to retreat, but the shadows followed. They seemed to be herding him toward a specific location. A trap, obviously. But what choice did he have? The alternative was to stand still and let the shadows reach him, and his instinct screamed that this would be a very bad idea. In the swamp simulation, Zara was discovering that Murphy's understanding of Rigelian physiology was disturbingly comprehensive. The water around her was laced with something that interfered with her species' natural echolocation abilities. She was effectively blind in an environment that could contain any number of hidden threats. She moved slowly, testing each step before committing her weight. The water was warm, uncomfortably so, and it seemed to be getting warmer. Not hot enough to cause damage, but warm enough to make her sluggish and uncomfortable. Murphy had clearly done his homework on Rigelian thermal tolerance. Or a ripple in the water caught her attention. Something large was moving beneath the surface. Something that definitely wasn't part of the original simulation parameters. Zara began to move faster, her tentacles providing propulsion through the increasingly hostile environment. Back in the forest, Lyra had managed to extract herself from the gravity trap and was proceeding more cautiously. She had identified at least 6 additional traps along the path, each one more sophisticated than the last. Murphy wasn't just trying to eliminate them. He was teaching them. Each trap was a lesson in observation, adaptation, and creative problem-solving. The realization was both comforting and terrifying. Comforting because it suggested Murphy wanted them to succeed. Terrifying because it implied the real challenges were yet to come. She reached a clearing where the path split into 3 directions. Each path was marked with a simple sign. The first read easy. The second read medium. The third read Murphy. Lyra stared at the signs for several seconds. The easy path was obviously a trap. Nobody would label the actual easy path as such. The medium path was probably the real easy path, disguised to make overconfident cadets avoid it. Which meant the Murphy path was what exactly? She was still pondering this when she heard the sound of approaching footsteps. Not hurried. Not concerned. Just steady, patient, and absolutely inexorable. Murphy was coming. Without further hesitation, Lyra chose the Murphy path. If she was going to be eliminated, she might as well face it head-on. The path led downward into what appeared to be a cave system. The walls were lined with bioluminescent fungi that provided just enough light to see without giving away her position. The air was cool and slightly humid, carrying scents that her species found instinctively unsettling. She had gone perhaps 100 meters when she encountered the first puzzle. The path was blocked by a series of energy barriers that flickered in a seemingly random pattern. But Lyra's analytical mind quickly identified the sequence. It was based on prime numbers, with each barrier deactivating according to a mathematical progression. She timed her movements carefully, slipping through the barriers one at a time. It was challenging but not impossible. Murphy was testing her intelligence, not just her physical abilities. The second puzzle was more complex. The path split into a maze of interconnected tunnels, each one containing different atmospheric conditions. One tunnel was filled with methane, another with ammonia, a third with an atmosphere so thin it was practically vacuum. Lyra realized that each tunnel was designed to test a different aspect of her species' environmental adaptability. She could survive in any one of them for a short time, but she needed to choose the right sequence to reach the other side without exhausting her reserves. It took her 17 minutes to solve the maze. When she emerged on the other side, she found Murphy waiting for her. He was sitting on a rock, apparently reading a book. He looked up as she approached and nodded approvingly. Then he pointed to a door marked exit and made a gesture that clearly meant go ahead. Lyra stared at him in confusion. "That's it. I passed." Murphy held up his data pad. The timer showed 23:14 remaining. Then he pointed to the exit again. "You want me to leave? But what about the others?" As Murphy's expression became serious, he pointed to himself, then to the tunnels behind them, then made a gesture that looked like hunting. The message was clear, his work here was done. Now he had others to find. Lyra hurried toward the exit, but stopped just before reaching it. "Sergeant Murphy?" "Thank you." Murphy looked up from his book and smiled. Not the predatory smile from before, but something warmer, more human. He saluted her with 2 fingers, then returned to his reading. Meanwhile, Marcus was learning that his confidence in close-quarters combat had been somewhat misplaced. The shadows had herded him into what appeared to be an abandoned warehouse, where he discovered that Murphy's understanding of psychological warfare extended far beyond simple intimidation. The warehouse was filled with mirrors. Not just regular mirrors, but mirrors that showed distorted reflections, delayed reflections, and in some cases no reflections at all. For a species that relied heavily on visual confirmation of their surroundings, it was a nightmare scenario. Marcus could hear movement all around him, but he couldn't pinpoint the source. The mirrors made it impossible to distinguish between real threats and false images. He was essentially fighting an enemy that existed everywhere and nowhere at once. That's when he heard Murphy's voice. The first time anyone had heard him speak. "Stop," Murphy said quietly. The words seemed to come from all directions at once. Marcus froze, his weapon trained on empty air. "You're fighting the wrong enemy," Murphy continued. "The mirrors aren't your problem. Your assumptions are." Marcus lowered his weapon slightly. "I don't understand. You entered this room expecting to fight me. But I'm not here. I'm 3 levels below you, dealing with a Vorthan cadet who thinks he can outsmart me with technical knowledge. The real test isn't whether you can defeat me in combat. It's whether you can defeat yourself." The voice was coming from speakers hidden throughout the warehouse. Murphy had been manipulating the environment remotely, using Marcus's own expectations against him. "The exit is behind the mirror marked with a red X," Murphy's voice continued. "You've walked past it 6 times because you were too busy looking for threats that didn't exist." Marcus turned and saw it immediately. A simple red X painted on one of the mirrors. He had indeed walked past it multiple times, but his focus on potential dangers had made him blind to the obvious solution. He approached the mirror and stepped through it. On the other side was a corridor leading to the extraction point. He had passed. In the swamp simulation, Zara was engaged in what could only be described as a philosophical debate with a holographic projection of Murphy. The real Murphy was presumably elsewhere, but the projection was conducting a Socratic dialogue about the nature of courage and the difference between bravery and stupidity. You entered the most dangerous path, the projection said, not because you analyzed the risks, but because you were afraid of appearing cowardly. That's not courage, that's ego. Zara's tentacles writhed with indignation. I chose the path because it seemed like the most direct route to the extraction point. Did you, or did you choose it because you thought it would impress me? The question hit uncomfortably close to home. Zara had indeed been motivated partly by a desire to prove herself, but she had also genuinely believed it was the most efficient route. Both, she admitted finally. Good. Honesty is the first step toward actual courage. The second step is learning to distinguish between necessary risks and unnecessary ones. The projection gestured toward the water around them. This swamp contains 17 different hazards that could eliminate you from the exercise, but it also contains a single safe path that leads directly to the extraction point. Your challenge is to find that path without letting your ego override your judgment. Zara spent the next 20 minutes carefully mapping the swamp's hazards, the warm water that interfered with her echolocation, the creature that moved beneath the surface, which turned out to be a harmless cleaning drone, the patches of quicksand that would trap anyone who moved too quickly. But she also found the safe path. It was marked with subtle chemical signatures that her species could detect if they weren't too distracted by obvious threats. Murphy had hidden the solution in plain sight, camouflaged by more dramatic dangers. When she reached the extraction point, she found 43 other cadets waiting for her. Not all of them had passed on their first attempt. Some bore the marks of Murphy's non-lethal elimination methods: scorch marks, temporary paralysis, and in one case what appeared to be a complete loss of short-term memory. How many made it? Zara asked Lyra. 44, including you. Murphy eliminated 193 cadets in the first hour. Zara's tentacles drooped with shock. That's an 81% failure rate. Actually, came Murphy's voice from behind them, it's an 81% learning rate. They turned to see him emerging from the training ground, looking exactly as fresh as when he had entered. His equipment was clean, his uniform was pressed, and he showed no signs of having just conducted a complex military operation against 237 opponents. Each eliminated cadet learned something about their own limitations, Murphy continued. About their assumptions, their fears, their weaknesses. That knowledge is more valuable than any grade or certification. He looked around at the assembled cadets who had passed his test. You 44 succeeded not because you were the strongest or the smartest, but because you were willing to adapt when your initial approach failed. That's the most important skill any soldier can possess. Commander Vector approached, his optical sensors gleaming with what might have been pride. Sergeant Murphy, that was illuminating. Your methods are unconventional, but the results speak for themselves. Murphy nodded once, then turned to address the cadets directly. War is not about following rules or executing perfect tactics. It's about surviving when everything you thought you knew turns out to be wrong. Today you learned that lesson without dying. Count yourselves lucky. He shouldered his backpack and began walking toward the academy building. Then he stopped and turned back. Oh, and cadets, your final grades will be based not on whether you passed or failed today, but on how you apply what you learned. I'll be watching. With that, he disappeared into the building, leaving behind 44 cadets who had just received the most valuable lesson of their military careers. The Marine had finally spoken, and his words were worth more than any lecture ever could be. Class dismissed.